Cool. Welcome to week 9. We'll continue talking about JavaScript and then we'll do our design lecture afterwards. So I guess this week we'll be covering how JavaScript meets HTML and CSS. So first, some announcements. Homework 8 was due at 7. So like right now, make sure you turn it in if you haven't turned it in already. Homework 9 is due next Tuesday. So as always, like right before class. Lab 9 is due on Friday before midnight. And then we'll be releasing the final project soon. I think hopefully this week, but you can check out some of the past projects that students have done. So some of the like top projects on our showcase website, and you can start like thinking about what kinds of things you want to work on. Yeah. So today we'll go over a review of what we covered last week with the variables and functions. And then we'll cover some new concepts. So things like objects, and then the DOM, and then also adding and removing CSS classes with JavaScript. So for the review, so we can start with reviewing variables. So variables in JavaScript are really similar to variables in math. We use them when we want to store a value and give it a name. And we would want to like create variables for values that we want to use over and over again. So in the example, we have the red part, which is let, and let just tells the computer basically that we're creating this variable. There are other ways to create it, but let is the one that we're going to focus on in this class. And then in blue, there's the name of the variable. And you want the variable names to be meaningful, right? So you could say something like name or age, but you don't want to just put like A, because A doesn't really mean anything. So when you're reading through your code, like you won't really know what you were referring to with that variable. So usually we try to use a noun, and then there's an equal sign, and then to the right of the equal sign is the value that we're storing in that variable. So in the top, it's Asia, which we put as a string. So if you remember, like strings have to have quotes around them so that the, I guess, browser knows that this is a string versus like a variable name. And then underneath there's like a number. So how we can use variables, we can basically save the variable, save a value to the variable, and then call the variable again later and use that value. So in the top example, first we save the value of 20 plus 5 to age. So age should equal 25 now. And then in the example highlighted in red, they do age minus 2.5. And this is actually incorrect. So we can actually do the like math for it, right? We can do 25 minus 2.5. But the problem with this is that like you're not really storing this value anywhere. So you're doing like a calculation that'll never be used in any way. So if we want to like actually make use of the value, we actually want to store it in another variable or the same variable. So below in the green box, we do age equals age times 2, which would give us 25 times 2, and then we would be able to store that into age. Yeah, so we want to reassign it or like put it into a new variable. And then next we have functions. So with functions, we need to define it first. But when we define a function, it's like the code doesn't actually run. We're just saying like, as if we're storing a variable, we're like storing, you know, things to do within our function. So here we have a function called showGreeting, and we can pass it a name. And then with that, it'll create this pop-up that says like howdy, and then the name that we passed in. So to actually call that function and run that piece of code with our inputs, we need to use the function name, which is showGreeting, and then within our parentheses. So you would need the parentheses to say like, oh, we're calling the function. But then because we need to pass in a parameter, we pass in a string of miles so that our function is able to actually run and like alert the user with the howdy miles. So continuing with using functions, before we just had the computer do something, right? Like we created this pop-up that would show up on our browser with the alert. Other things you can do is actually have it return something. So return means that this is like the final value that we want to output from our function. So we can create functions like square, which is something that we might want to do over and over again to different values. And then we can call that the same ways we called the functions before. So square, and then within the parentheses, we can pass in a value of like 5. And then we actually store that output. So the thing that's returned in the return statement to y. And then we can use y to call the function again, and then store that in z. So moving on, I guess we'll cover a new concept from before, which is objects. So so we'll introduce this new concept. And then basically what we do when we write code is that we're trying to take like things that we see around us in the world and think about how we like describe it in English to create a representation that computers can understand and that they could use and they can modify in the code. So previously we've only talked about like being able to store numbers and strings, but our world is much more complex. So what do we do if we want to store something more complex or like represent it? So I guess the main goal of this is just to teach that complex things are composed of simple things, and we'll go over an example. So here we have a car, and this is a very complex object, right? Like there's different car models, there's different car colors. So there's a lot of different properties that a car can have that makes each car unique, but they're all cars. So objects are a way of representing these more complex items in JavaScript. And then there are a collection of methods or functions, and then properties, which are like the different variables. So when we're trying to convert these like real life objects into code, like JavaScript objects, we want to think about what we want to do in English before we convert it to code. So for our example, this like red car in the photo, we can think about some of the properties of a car. So that can include things like the color of the car, which is red, the model, how fast it's currently going, so the miles per hour, and then also some of the functions a car can do. So that can include things like driving straight, braking. They could change the color by painting the car. And these are the different properties and functions that we'll want to include in our object. So our car object, now we're able to take these and like kind of create different variables or like properties and functions for them. So we can have the color stored as a string. The model can also be stored as a string, but the miles per hour it's currently traveling as, that might be better stored as a number. And then similarly, the functions, if we want to have a function to have it drive straight, we don't really need an input, right? We just need it to drive straight. And then there's also the brake, which also doesn't really need an input. And then changing the color, we have to pass in a new color it should change to. So that's why we have the parameter color. And then so we can create this object in JavaScript. So we can think about the different properties and functions we had, and then we create that object. So how you do that is we want to define a variable. So we're creating this car, and then to create this object, we actually use like the curly braces. And then within those curly braces, we have the property or function name, and then the colon, and then like the value of that. So you can see that we have like the properties in the first three. So we have color :red. So we're saying like this car that we're defining in particular is red. It's like a Tesla Model S, and it's like not driving basically. And then similarly for the functions, you would fill in the functions with code, but for, I guess, like brevity, we just have like these three functions that we define: drive, straight, brake, and change color, as the functions for our car object. And then you'll notice that there's commas like after each property or function, just so that like they're separate. But yeah, this is a lot of syntax, and we understand that. So I guess like if you're worried about it, we won't use objects basically at all in this class, so you don't need to worry. It's just, I guess, like a good skill to be able to recognize how these variables can be more complex than just a number or just a string, and that they can have their own properties and functions. Yeah, so how you would use these objects. So we have the car we defined earlier on the left. And then if we want to refer to the different properties within that object, we would use like dot notation. So if you see in the first line on the right, we have console.log, which prints out the things within the brackets. And here we want to print out the car color. So we would say car, which is our like object name, and then use the dot and say, oh, I want the color of the car. And then, so when we print that, we would get red. Similarly, you can call the functions. So we can say like our car object dot drive straight, and that will call the drive straight function, and then also the changing color. And then, so now we can go back to how the HTML and JavaScript meet. Oh yeah, that's like the same things. So we'll cover the DOM. And what the DOM is a document object model. And so basically when the HTML page is loaded, JavaScript creates like its own representation of the page, which is made up of these different objects. So these different like squares. And then each HTML tag in our page or in our document is an object. So here we have like 4 examples, but obviously like with a more complex page, you'll have many more, and they'll like have children, right? Like within our body, we see that we have like a header tag and then like a list. But within our list, we'll have like the list items. So our DOM can get very complex. And then also here you'll see that we have like listed functions and properties within each of the HTML objects. But in reality, there's like so many more. I think like if you like display them all in the console, when you want to like debug, you can see that you have to scroll for a while to get through all of them, because there's things like accessibility properties and just like different ways of retrieving the items. But all of the HTML elements on the page have like the same sets of properties. So like we won't go over them in depth in class. So this is just like a sample of what you might see. But we'll focus on the document first of all. So the document is like our entire HTML page. It's like the root of everything, I want to say. And within document, we have this function called getElementById. And this is something really important and we'll use a lot in this class, like starting now, because it's, I think, really foundational to being able to interact with your HTML page with your JavaScript. So what is document.getElementById? So it takes one argument, which is a string, and that will be the ID of the HTML element we want. So if you remember, within a page or like your HTML document, IDs should be unique. So we can get like each item by its unique ID, and then we'll like be able to select that item because there's only one of those. And then it'll return whichever like HTML element has that ID. So I guess like how you use it. So if we have this piece of code on the bottom right, it's a list that has an ID of food-list, and then also a class blue-box, and then it has a bunch of the list items inside with like different restaurants. And then you can also see like what the DOM element might look like on the left. We'll be able to get the item, I guess, this unordered list object using document.getElementById. by ID. So it'll look through our entire document and look for this ID that we passed in food list, and it'll see that it refers, it's a property of like this unordered list, and then we would get this item. And then within this unordered list object, we have different properties that we'll cover in a minute. Things like class list, the inner HTML, style, and children. And there's also many more. So example. So again, we can get our food list element by using getElementById, and then that'll return like this, I guess like DOM object. And then we can use some of the properties. So if you remember previously, it had the ID food list, but it also had a class blue box. So by using class list, which is one of the properties, and we refer to that using dot notation, we'll actually get a list. And within that list, we'll have each of the classes, right? Because you can have multiple classes, but in our case, we only have one, and that is blue box. So that's what that will return. And then again, with the inner HTML, it'll return all the HTML within that, I guess, like element. So with our unordered list, there's a bunch of different list items. So that was like the mezzos, all the different restaurants. And that's how we can get that. And then similarly, children will also return the like elements inside of the unordered list. So in this case, we can see that we have 3 list items as a list. So why are we doing this? So in our last lecture, we covered like some examples of the things that JavaScript can do, right? It can do things like when the user clicks on this image, we want it to increase the image size. So like maybe it becomes like a pop-up. And then so when we say we want it to increase its size, in CSS, that means really just changing the width of the image. And to change the width of the image, we have to be able to get the image. Similarly, when the user clicks on this specific button, then we want to change our colors to a dark mode version. So with changing colors to dark mode, we want to change, again, the CSS color and background color attributes. Yeah, so to convert these in code, we would get like this button by looking for an element with the ID dark mode button, or and then to change CSS, like we'll cover that. But yeah. And then so we just did like getElementById, but there's also other ways to select these different elements in your DOM. So getElementById, use the ID, but let's say not all of your elements in your HTML have an ID, which is really common. It's not necessary to assign an ID to everything, especially if you're like not applying CSS to it, you're not like selecting it very often. So there's something called query selector, and it works really similarly to getElementById, but rather than taking in an ID, it takes in any CSS selector. So if you've been writing like CSS, you'll know that we can do things like P, and it'll select all the paragraph tags. Well, we could also pass P into query selector. Yeah, so query selector takes one argument as a string, which is like a CSS selector of the HTML element we want. So that can be P for paragraph, but that can also be things like the ID. So it can do the same thing as get element by ID, or you can also pass in a class. But the thing with query selector, it actually only returns the first element object that matches the selector name. So even if you have like 3 different paragraphs, it'll only give you the first one. And then if we use an ID, so if we pass in like hashtag, I think it was food list, then we'll get the same thing as get element by ID. So how we use this function is very similar to get element by ID. We just want to pass in a string, but because we're using query selectors, we have to do the same thing as we do in CSS. So all of our IDs would use like the hashtag before the ID, whereas when we used get element by ID, we didn't need the hashtag. And then it'll select the same element that we got from when we use get element by ID, because we're doing the same thing, which is the food list. If we want, we can also use UL, which is the HTML tag for the list. And this will only work if this list was like the first list on our page. But since it was like the only list that we have, this will work exactly the same way. And then it'll get like the same item. It's just multiple ways to refer to the same element. Yeah, so if we have the code on the left, so 2 divs with the same class child, when we say document.querySelector child, we would only expect to see the first div, so child1 returned. And that's because query selector only selects the first child. Yeah. And then last thing that we'll cover is adding and removing CSS classes with JavaScript. So turns out that the result of foodlist.classlist, which returned like a list of the classes that foodlist had, isn't just a list, but it's actually another object. So if we want to look at this like more visually, we have our document, and that's like all of our HTML code, and it has functions like get element by ID. And then so we can use that function and we can get our food list using the ID. And then within that food list, we can get the class list, which is one of its properties, which will give us the class blue box, right? And then that class list is also an object that has its own functions. And the major functions that we'll use are add, remove, and toggle. And so with a list, you can add things to the list, remove things from the list, or toggle. So toggle is like, if it's there, then you remove it. If it's not there, then you add it. Yeah. And then so here we are. In order to change our CSS with JavaScript, first we want to get the element that we want to change the CSS of. In this case, it's the food list that we had. We can get that by using document.getElementById, and we pass in the list ID, which was food list, as a string, and then we can save that to a variable so we can refer to it over and over again rather than having to call this entire function with our variable. And then we can print out the class list to console just so it's easier for us to understand what's going on. And then that will give us this list that contains only blue box. But because you can have elements with multiple classes. If there were more than just one class, we would see like multiple different strings in this list. And then so if we want to, I guess add a dark mode, we can actually use the add function that lists have. So we get the food list class list, and then we use its function add, and then we pass it a string, and the string is dark mode. And then so now that if we print out the class list like we did previously, we'll see that we actually have two classes in our list. And so we went from only having blue box to blue box and dark mode. And this would basically apply the CSS that we had for the class dark mode, assuming that, we created this like CSS in our CSS file and we linked everything correctly. Yeah, so that's again, like we go from the document and we get this element, and then within our element, we have the property class list that we can have like take advantage of the different functions that it has to do cool things like adding and removing dark modes. Yeah, so in our case, we used add, but then once we add on a dark mode, like you also want to be able to leave it. So we can use remove. It works very similarly to add, where we pass in a string that we want to remove, or a class that we want to remove. And then if we print out that list, it'll just have blue box, which is what we started with originally. So we can add the dark mode class, and then we can, turn dark mode on for our website, given that we have the CSS for it. And then when we remove the dark mode class, that CSS won't be applied anymore. And that's how you can create like a dark mode, light mode toggler. Oh, so a demo. I don't think I have the demo link. So I think we'll cover it in lab. So hopefully you attend lab. Yeah, so if we think about this functionality, when we want to add like JavaScript functionality to our web page, we want to think about it as like when the user clicks on some element, so that could be like a button or a link or an image, then we want to change or add or remove some piece of HTML or CSS. So in our previous example, it was when we clicked on maybe like the list, then we wanted to add like the dark mode. But we could do like, if we click on the button, then we want to like, I don't know, also toggle the dark mode, or we can enlarge this picture, things like that. So the getting the button or the link or the image, we can do that by getting the element by its ID or using query selector. And then to add, change, or remove, that's using the JavaScript, often probably the class list, and then we can modify the HTML and CSS for that. And then in the next lecture, we'll actually put this all together. So you'll have a better understanding of like the whole change from the JavaScript to the CSS and the HTML. Are there any questions? Oh, okay. Does age times equals 2 work? That's like a language thing. I want to say it should, but we can test it out. If I just open like a console. If we say like let age equals 20 plus 5, and then age times equals 2. Yeah, so we'll see that age will actually give us 50. Yeah, so for JavaScript, the times equal 2 will work. And then do you define the variables inside or outside of the function? I'm not too sure which part of the slides that was referring to. Do you want to clarify your question, Juliana? I guess it might be around here because it was sent like pretty close then. So here we define certain variables inside the function, but we can also define variables outside the function. And that's why we want to use let, because let allows us to easily scope our variables. So here we have this variable greeting that we create within our function. And that's just to make like creating our alert easier, right? But in other cases, like here, we have our let's creating these variables outside of the function. And that's because like we use them outside of the function. So it depends on the situation where you would want to use the variable. But using let means that the variables we create inside the function only should work inside of our functions. Are there any other questions? If not, we can take a break. I don't know, like 5 minutes, so we can start again at 7:50.
Sorry, wait. My computer is really slow right now, so it's taking a while to load. Now let me stop sharing and try it again. All right, let me try again. And if it doesn't work, Lily can share a screen and then I can just talk over it. Okay. I hope this works. I think I had like too many Chrome tabs open. Okay, honestly, it's like not responding when I click present. So Lily, do you mind sharing your screen instead?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's become unresponsive, so I can't share. Okay, great. So we're going to kind of switch gears from Lily's lecture about JavaScript meeting HTML, CSS, and we're going to talk about dark design patterns instead. So let's watch this video first. It's titled "Why Cities Are Full of Uncomfortable Benches," and it's a video by Vox. And it'll kind of introduce you to like a very prime example of dark design.
Are cities full of uncomfortable benches? This one has armrests to prevent you from dozing off. Here's another, again with the arms, the stiff metal. And this one, it's brand new. The MTA in New York City began installing them as a part of a subway enhancement plan. And they don't call it a bench. They prefer the term leaning bars. So what if I told you it was designed with discomfort in mind? New York City is filled with some of the most innovative architecture and urban planning in the world. Today, nearly every kind of public space here has been developed with close attention to detail. So these benches are no mistake. They're designed to allow you to sit, but not get too cozy, and that's intentional. The concept stems from a school of thought that goes by many names, but today we'll use defensive design. Defensive design is about moderating behavior. The goal is to limit the ways an object can be misused. These benches have armrests because that will prevent anyone from laying down. Their short back is another nod to say this bench isn't yours forever. This trend is worldwide, and it's not just in the benches. When you start looking for defensive designs in New York City, you'll find examples everywhere. It's the presence of security cameras in subway turnstiles or in Times Square. It's these spikes on this column meant to deter birds. It's the knobs on these ledges made to discourage skateboarders. And there were once sprinklers underneath the awning of this bookstore to prevent people from sleeping there. It's sidewalk barriers. It's even these regular streetlights. Yeah, streetlights are probably some of the most recognizable defensive designs. When they surfaced in 19th century Western cities, the dynamic of urban life changed. Because of them, more people spent more time outside at night, which drove economic development and a reduction in crime. Most hostile architecture tries to influence behavior in a similar way. The designs attempt to make public space a bit more hospitable, more ideal. Defensive designs can deter crime. It can prevent the destruction of public property, and it can prevent loitering. But there is a reason why defensive design is characterized as hostile. Take the example of the leaning bar. Disability advocates have a problem with that appearing in the MTA. One advocate pointed out that people who travel who have disabilities or just get tired sometimes need a bench to sit on, and not a wall to lean against. And while no one likes an uncomfortable bench, these additions mean something more for people who are experiencing homelessness. The United States is currently experiencing a decline in the overall homeless population. But in New York City, the number of homeless people is growing. About 1,800 people were found to have been sleeping in the subway. That's because emergency shelter isn't always a viable option. There are several examples of hostile architecture that target people who are homeless. These designs imply that public space is not where homeless people should be. As it goes, city planners have a dilemma. How do they design inclusive cities? As for the Enhanced Subway Initiative, the MTA's mock designs highlight new USB ports and electronic signage in stations. But you won't find any press materials highlighting this uncomfortable bench. Excuse me, the leaning bar. That's because it makes for an uncomfortable discussion about who we design public space for, and who gets left out.
Okay, let's go back to the slides. Yeah, so as you can tell from that video that you just watched, there are so many instances of defensive design occurring in large cities such as New York. Chiefly like the bench that you just saw, like the leaning bar, it was made so that homeless people cannot like lie on them and like sleep on them. But it also restricts, people who are like physically disabled from sitting down when they're waiting for the train to come. So in many ways, like the architects who design these leaning bars or like benches, and like when they place handles like in the middle of the benches, they like know what they're doing, because like adding handles to a bench is like extra effort. Like, why would you put in that effort, right? But it's there because it serves a purpose, and that purpose is to restrict usages of that bench for certain things, such as sleeping or laying down on them. So yeah, let's try to get a little bit more technical about what like terminologies people tend to use when they're talking about dark design. So the first one is, as you heard in the video, defensive design. Defensive design can be defined as the practice of anticipating all possible ways that an end user could misuse a device, and designing the device so as to make sure that such misuse is impossible or to minimize the negative consequences. So essentially, like, you're adding things and you're kind of like adding features to a certain product that, and restricts a lot of potential uses of that device. And this can be used for good or it can be used for bad, right? So you will kind of see later on in these slides what the potential like bad examples of this could be. The next definition is dark/unpleasant design. So this is kind of similar in terms of like intentional design to make people do something, except this is more like you're tricking them to do something instead of like intentional. So dark or unpleasant design is a user interface that has been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things, such as buying insurance with their purchase or signing up for recurring bills. I think one example of this is like when you're trying to buy a plane ticket and the insurance option is often like automatically checked. So you might miss it if you don't fully read the entire page of your order. You might just have that insurance checked and you'll be paying more for the flight insurance when you actually don't want to. So a lot of websites tend to employ a lot of these like really hidden tactics to get you to do things, even though you're not aware that you're doing them in the first place. So some more terms for you guys. Forced continuity. So this is kind of what I already alluded to in the previous slide. It happens when your free trial with the service comes to an end and your credit card silently starts getting charged without any warning. In some cases, this is made even worse by making it difficult to cancel the membership. So I don't know how many of you guys bought the masterclass like $1 subscription thing last year when they offered it to like Berkeley students or whatever. So I bought that. It was like around September, right? That was when the deal was. And I know like a bunch of students, including me, like almost forgot about canceling the subscription, because all of these subscription models, the way they work is that they give you this like really good deal where it's like completely free or like really cheap. But because they take your credit card information and they have it in their database, they can continue charging you the original amount of that subscription plan, even after that like time period of your deal runs out. And so a lot of students I know, like they got charged like $180 because that's the annual masterclass subscription fee, right? So if you don't remember to cancel your account, you're going to be charged $180. Some companies are lenient and nice enough to like refund you if you email them and say like, oh, I forgot to cancel my subscription. I didn't mean to like, pay an extra $180. They'll give you your money back, which is the case for me when I emailed Masterclass. But some companies, they're really strict about it. They'll be like, oh, like, sorry, you forgot to cancel, like that's your fault. So yeah, this is another example of a dark design pattern. So the next definition is called bait and switch. So bait and switch happens when a website advertises a free or generally reduced product or service, which is wholly unavailable or stocked in very small quantities. So after it's apparent that this product that you originally viewed is no longer available, you become exposed to other priced products, which are similar to the one advertised. So basically the website or the company baits you with a very good product that's like free or like very cheap. But then it turns out that that product is out of stock, right? But then because they tend to show you like all these similar or like recommended products next to it, your eyes start to drift to those products, and then you'll be more likely to buy them. So that's the process of switching your attention to those products. So this is another example of dark design. I feel like this is a lot more like subtle and not as bad as the other ones, because you're still given the choice and you have the sort of like faculty or like power to like do what you want. So it's not necessarily tricking you, but it is like baiting you in the sense that like, oh, the thing you came for originally is not available anymore, and you have to like look towards other options. All right, so now we're going to step through some examples of really bad designs, specifically really asshole designs. So like designs that are, meant to do harm, more harm than good, whether it is intentional or not. So the first example is this website. So as you can see, like once you open a website, you like press enter, and then there's the show notifications pop-up that comes up. And this happens really, really often on a lot of websites, especially when you go to a website that's like a blog or something like that. Like if you go on like, I don't know, TechCrunch or something, you'll probably see such a notification pop-up come up, and it's just really annoying. And like you can't proceed with any parts of the website before you respond to that pop-up. So you have to press allow or block in order to proceed with using the website. So that's something that is kind of like assholey and like a bit annoying to get around. The second example, this is kind of funny. So here you see there's two examples of misleading packaging. So the first one on the left side, we have like at the very top, like a rolled, I guess, like sandwich. But then when you open it, you see that it's actually cut in half. But then originally, like you would think that it would be a one piece, like entirely, right? But instead, they actually cut it in half, and you're getting a lot less than you paid for. Similarly, on the right side, we have this cheese and jam sandwich. And on the top picture, you can see that the sandwich on the inside is lined with jam. So you think that like from this view, from this angle, that the entire piece of that bread is like spread with jam, right? But then when you open it, it seems like only the front side is lined with jam, and most of the bread actually doesn't have any jam on it. So that's another example of sort of like asshole design. Like they're really just tricking their customers into thinking that they're getting more than they paid for. The third example is honestly really assholey, I think. So, sometimes when you get like spam emails and like you sign up for something, but you actually like want to cancel those emails, a lot of times they don't really give you the option to unsubscribe very obviously. So like here you can see this is a like subscription / like company like marketing email. And like until you hover or like you highlight the text at the bottom of this email, you will not see that there's the customer support and especially the unsubscribe button. So they purposely hide it in white text so you don't see when you first view the email. You'd have to like highlight the text to see that there's an unsubscribe button. So that's also another example of a assholey design. So this one is kind of the like example of recurring continuity. So like you sign up for something thinking that you'll pay for like, or like you won't pay for 3 days starting now, but then in that same transaction you make, you are also agreeing to the subscription of $49.99 per week starting on a certain date, like 3 days from now. So you can't like specifically make the choice of, oh, I will pay, or like I won't pay for 3 days. You have to say, oh, I won't pay for 3 days, and then I will pay 3 days starting from now. So they kind of trick you into like agreeing to these like long-term subscription plans from like the very beginning. Like they force you to agree to both options, and they don't give you the option to just not pay for like 3 days. So that's another example of an asshole design. So we have a quote on this slide that says, "There's a simple reason why brands employ dark UX tactics. They want to nudge the user towards or away from certain actions in order to drive sales, gather more data, or bump up their email list." So as you can see in the previous examples, like for example, the email newsletter, like they don't want to make it easy for you to unsubscribe to their email list. So that's, one purpose of why they decide to hide the unsubscribe button in white text. And then also like in terms of the subscription like continuity problem, they want to like kind of trick you into paying long-term for a subscription plan, even when you don't want to, and you only paying for the free option. So a lot of brands, they like intentionally employ a lot of these dark tactics because they want to drive up sales, and they want to like ultimately benefit their own like profits and like marketing goals. In some cases, like it might seem like the examples I showed you are a bit more like innocuous or a bit like less harmful, like outwardly harmful to people, but in some cases, it might turn from just nuisance to regret. So, some designs, they might actually raise a lot of very concerning ethical concerns. So here are some examples of that. Instacart, so in their app, I'm not sure how many of you guys use Instacart, but in their app, it's the default tip that you pay grocery shoppers. So like the way Instacart works is that you place an order for like what you want to buy from a local grocery market, right? And then a delivery person will actually go to that grocery store and check out all your items for you, and then drive all the way to your house to drop them off. So those like shoppers, you might think like, oh, they should get tipped a lot because they're doing all this work for you. But in Instacart, they have the default option set to only 5% tip, which is really low compared to a lot of other grocery shopping apps where they will pay their shoppers like 15 to 20% tip. So this is an example of dark design that kind of compromises the welfare and earnings of their own users, which are the grocery shoppers. So the next example is back in 2014, Snapchat came out with a Bob Marley like live filter, and so this basically became a huge problem because Bob Marley is Black, and they essentially made this filter like a blackface filter because it turned whoever uses the filter into someone who's Black, and this raised a lot of very I guess like concerns on like social media and stuff because obviously this is not acceptable, and Snapchat definitely should have like thought through their design process before they came out with this. So this is another example of where a tech company or just a company in general, they want to do something, but then they forget to think about like the ethical complications or like the impacts of what they're doing. So this is another example of sort of like underlying like racism in the way that a lot of technology is currently implemented. So in 2015, I think this came out about the Google Photos algorithm. So as you can see, like it pretty much like identifies all of these topics like really accurately. Like you see a skyscraper, an airplane, a car, a bike, whatever. But then in the one you see in the middle, like it basically identified these African American people as gorillas, and that's obviously incredibly offensive. And there's a lot of instances where a lot of like image detection algorithms, like they tend to like identify like African American people as like these like animals, like because their colors are dark. And so there's a lot of examples of like how a lot of people who are creating these technology, they tend to not really think about making a very comprehensive like test suite that will like check that like this algorithm will work not only for like light colored or light skin people, but also like darker skinned people. So this is another example of where like, people who are in design and in tech, they should definitely like be more aware and be more conscious of what their technology is being used on. And this last example is Facebook's emotional manipulation experiment. So this is a study that was done to kind of evaluate the positive as well as detrimental impacts of the Facebook recommendation algorithm. So you guys might have probably like seen articles about this already. I know there's been like a documentary that was released about how like a lot of social media algorithms are super, super detrimental to the way our brains are sort of like wired to think in different perspectives. And it forces people to become more and more polarized as time goes on. So basically, like if you see something negative on your Facebook feed, and you continue seeing those like negative posts, like you yourself will start to embody that negativity, and you will start posting posts that will be of more negative like emotions and connotations. And I think this has one of the most detrimental impacts in terms of like political polarization. Like if you, because like Facebook algorithm tries to, cater things that you would enjoy reading and you would agree with, right? So like they just push things that like you would agree with on your screen, and they don't show things that you would disagree with. And because of that, they polarize you more and more, and you start to think like, oh, this is right, like this is what should be like real or like valid, and then you don't see any other perspectives, and so that creates a lot of polarization. So Facebook definitely has a lot of like ethical concerns when it comes to how they design the technology to be used, because obviously like if people enjoy what they're seeing, they're gonna use it more, and because they use it more, Facebook will gain more profits. So their ultimate like goal is to drive revenues and sales, but that will come at the expense of a lot of like ethical implications, such as like polarization, spreading like negative like I don't know, thoughts and like opinions, and just in general, like it's not very healthy for users ultimately. So on a high level, what does this mean for designers? As a UX designer, you have a responsibility towards both the brand and the user. It is your job to create unbeatable user experiences that are transparent and unambiguous, making it easy for the user to take the course of action they have indeed set out to take. So basically, like as a designer, you need to like think about like what the purpose of like what you're creating is, and you want to make that like fully transparent and unambiguous. Like for example, in thinking about the cut up sandwich, like they know what they were doing, and that purpose was not like honest and transparent, because the customer paid for a sandwich that was a lot smaller than they thought it was, or had a lot less jam than they thought it would have. So you want to make sure that like you're honest to your users, because when you portray a lot of dishonesty in the UX experience, like you're gonna lose those customers in the long run. So it's really important to be aware of like what you're designing for your brand. So now I'll like sort of open up the conversation to you guys, and thinking about what are some dark patterns in your own daily interactions that you've noticed. And you guys can like feel free to like type in the chat or unmute yourself to speak.
I think the most common is definitely those apps with the subscriptions. Um, like I did a 14-day trial for Surfline, and I knew they were going to charge me like something like $198 if I didn't, cancel the subscription. So I put it on my calendar to make sure, because I did not want to miss that date. But it's just like, it was hard to cancel it too. Like I had to go on the computer and like try to figure it out. It was not easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had like a very similar experience with Masterclass actually. Like I knew that I had to cancel it on this date, so I like put it on my calendar and everything. But then like when it came around to that date, I checked the website and it said that my subscription was ending like this year. on September, like, I don't know, 12th, 2021. And so that made me think like, oh, it's already canceling by itself. Like, I don't have to do anything. But that text was so misleading. Like, it meant that like this year is ending like on this date, but like you're still going to be charged recurringly. And so like I ended up being charged again, even though I thought based on the website that it said like it would end on like this date of this year. So I like ended up emailing them and everything. And they were nice about it. They like gave me a refund, but like that was definitely intentional. I feel like putting the deadline as like September 12th, 2021, instead of saying like, oh, it will renew on this date.
Right. That's so true. Yeah, I hate that. That's like the most common thing I've noticed for sure.
Mhm. Does anyone else have anything that they've noticed that kind of represents a dark design pattern? Emily in the chat says the echo chambers and hyper politicization that was facilitated by social media feed algorithms was a huge one, especially during quarantine where everyone was on their phone and during elections. It turned us into two different Americas that got two very different informations on social media. Yeah, definitely. Like it's kind of like a similar line to what I talked about for like Facebook's recommendation algorithm. Like it really tends to drive people to like opposite ends of the spectrum. Like you might have been in the middle at the beginning of the pandemic, but because of the constant stream of like the same articles and like the same, you know, people with the same ideas like being pushed onto your feed more and more, you tend to like become a lot more homogenous in terms of your ideas, and you don't really like challenge yourself to think outside of your original perspective. So yeah, I agree. It's like really, really harmful. All right, let's move on. I think there's like one last slide. So I don't know if you have time to play this video, but it's another video by Fox, and basically their message in this video is that phones are designed to be addicting. I think this was also highlighted in that documentary that I forgot the name of, but it talked about how like Facebook is super harmful to like people's mental health, and also just the polarization of like today's political state. And also the fact that like phones themselves, like as devices, are designed to be addictive. Like you're supposed to use them like many hours of the day. I don't know about you guys, but like sometimes my screen time is like really, really high. And so like whenever my iPhone tells me like, oh, your weekly screen time went up by like 22% this week, and I just like get kind of sad. I'm like, oh shit, like I didn't even realize that I was doing that. Like I was spending so much time on my phone. So yeah, it's like definitely something that, you know, might, you know, get worse and worse over time, like if people don't, you know, actively stop designing these phones to be so addictive. So this last slide has a link to a letter, and it's like on Medium. It's basically an article that describes like, you know, as a designer, like you should, you know, pay more attention to, you know, what it means to be a human being. So like you're not just designing something to like make profits or, you know, improve a brand's like awareness. Like it also comes down to like how, you know, you kind of like operate and like how you feel and like interact with other people as a human being. So yeah, I guess like if you like scroll down, like I guess to skim this article, like you're responsible for the impact that you have when you're designing something. And so like a lot of it is about discipline, making sure that like you consider all different sides before you like release something. And yeah, this article just goes on to describe like as a designer, like you should be more aware of the things you're doing and like welcome criticism, knowing your audience, and yeah, just being more aware of like the work that you're doing and how it impacts other people. Okay, with that, that's the end of the design lecture. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they want to make with regards to what we've talked about? Okay, if not, thank you guys for coming, and we'll see you in lab this Thursday. Lily, can you stop the recording?